Here in the midst of the Democratic primary season, it's good to recall the words of that great political philosopher, Mario Cuomo. Campaigning is poetry. Governing is prose. Well, like the bourgeois gentilhomme, Hugh Heclo has been speaking prose all his life, or at least all his adult life. After all, that's not so bad. Dickens, Trollope, Jane Austen also spoke prose. He is the preeminent student of American governing. He has done the best work of anyone in trying to figure out how this great Leviathan of ours actually works. He's penetrated the world of public agencies, congressional committees, and Gucci-clad lobbyists, observing it with clinical precision and diagnostic acuity. Of late, his mind has turned more to questions of religion and the relationship of religion to American politics. This doesn't really represent as radical a turn from studying the nuts and bolts of American government as it might first appear. Hugh has long recognized that in a democratic republic, affairs of state and affairs of souls are not so radically separated. In 2002, I heard him deliver the only sermon I've ever heard at the American Political Science Convention. Remember, to an audience of public administration specialists, perhaps the least soulful of all political scientists. He gave a talk on the spirit of public administration. Citing Etienne Gilson's book on the spirit of Thomism, he first explained what it meant to study the spirit of something. He announced that he was seeking to understand the quote-unquote inner life of public administration. He then gave the pithiest discussion of the fact-value distinction I've ever heard. Quote, "The wall of separation between fact and value is a half-truth pretending to be the whole truth of the matter. And so at its heart, it is a lie. Physicians want to observe the real facts precisely because they are not indifferent between health and illness. Firemen want to know the difference between real and false alarms because they are not neutral between people and property burning or not burning." He concluded by describing public administration as a calling. Again, I quote, "The best single word for the spirit of public administration is stewardship. This means a calling to take care for the well-being of the public household." And as these lovely quotations show, Hugh Heclo's calling is in the true spirit of the Bradley Lectures, the effort to combine an understanding of religion with an understanding of politics.
Well, thank you. I obviously don't deserve that kind of introduction. And I'm not even sure I deserve you coming out on a day like this. You've already paid me an extraordinary compliment just to be here, although I see some student pens poised and suspect that it may be a class assignment for some of us, but not all of us. The question I'm talking about today, in the land where I come from, the northern Shenandoah Valley, is not really a serious question at all. Everybody knows the answer to the question, is America a Christian nation, where I come from? But you're going to hear a lot about it, I suspect, in the current campaign season, especially given the court decision of the last week on gay marriages. The whole question of the Christianity of America, its laws, its culture, and so on, is going to be very much in the public eye. And so with that notion of not trying to necessarily be topical, but to try and be helpfully relevant to what's topical, I chose, given all the freedom I was given on this evening, to ask a question that I think is important to think about. Is America a Christian nation? By way of introduction, Congress had made it unlawful for American employers to prepay the transportation costs for anyone in a foreign country to perform labor or service of any kind in the United States. In other words, the law said you cannot prepay to bring in someone to work in the United States. Holy Trinity Church of New York did exactly that by prepaying the expenses of the English Reverend E. Walpole Warren to be their rector and pastor. So they were immediately taken to court. When the case came before the Supreme Court, the justices had no trouble at all reaching a decision. The court case is called Holy Trinity Church. Unanimous court decision was that Congress could not possibly have intended this law to apply to churches. More than that, the court said, no purpose of action against religion could ever be imputed to any piece of national or state legislation because, quote, this is a religious people, unquote. Then, going on, the unanimous court decision said, these and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation, unquote. Well, contrary to what one might expect today, there was not a ripple of opinion or public comment on this decision. Admittedly, it was a trivial case, but you can imagine what would have been the public comment if the decision had gone the other way using the other kind of logic. Turn it on its head. In that case, the logic would have been that, yes, Congress's clear prohibition sweeping in labor or service of any kind must have been intended to include clergymen, since this is not necessarily a Christian nation. And believe me, that would have caused some public comment if the court had reasoned and so decided in such a way. The writer of the court's decision was Justice David Brewer, son of a Congregationalist missionary to Turkey, grandson of a New England Congregationalist minister. Brewer would go on, Justice Brewer, later in that decade of the 1890s, to publicly address the idea of the turning of the century and the coming of the 20th century, generally to a very optimistic conclusion and prediction about the fate of American Christianity and its thriving future in the United States in the 20th century. While Brewer's identification of the United States as not simply a religious nation, a Christian nation, aroused hardly any dispute or comment at all, even to ask this question at the beginning of the 21st century is a political provocation. You can be sure if the Supreme Court handed down a decision with even one dissenting justice today saying that America's a Christian nation, the public comment would be very vigorous indeed. Our question is provocative because of what it presupposes. One thing it presupposes, of course, is that by asking the question, we don't really know who we are. And to some people, it's uncomfortable to think that our cultural identity might be in such a state of disarray. But the real provocative nature of this question stems mainly from the presupposition that America must be one thing or the other, a Christian nation or a non-Christian nation. And if that is so, then some viewpoints and identities and people are included and others are excluded by implication. And this is a provocation because ours is a time when the only allowable prejudice is against non-inclusiveness. Or to put it another way, exclusion is the main thing normatively excluded today. And yet, for all the emphasis in today's America on accepting the other, as it's called, it's a curious thing how many people on opposite sides are offended by what they see going on in America. More curious still, different sides are offended, it seems, in the same mutually contradictory way. Politically active Christians on the conservative right typically claim they're on the defensive against powerful secular forces grinding away at the religious character of our laws and institutions and culture. In a sense, The religionists' answer to our question is that America is a Christian nation, but misguided people today are trying to change that. By contrast, politically active secularists on the liberal left, usually at least, typically claim that they're on the defensive against an aggressive Christian conservative movement and its narrow-minded moralizing. And in this sense, the secularist answer to our question is that America is not a Christian nation, but misguided people are trying to change that. Each side politically finds the other useful to keep the partisan juices and perhaps the fundraising going, but there's more to it than that. What's at stake is extremely important because the agenda of both sides that I've just described is trying to claim possession of one of the most powerful of all political narratives, the story of decline, resistance, and restoration. So my purpose in asking, is America a Christian nation, is not simply to talk about how one might explore the subject, but to work through the conceptual underbrush to actually answer the question. I think often we academics spend a lot of time talking about how important it is to appreciate the complex and uncertain nature of a subject. We savor the tentativeness of every possible answer. Now, such carefulness, I think, is entirely praiseworthy. But in valuing carefulness, academics outside the hard sciences often forget that the objective in asking a question is not just to seek answers, but to actually find them. As the British historian R.H. Tawney once put it to a departed friend of mine, for their students and the larger public, social scientists have a tendency to create a darkness and call it scholarship. So now we're 6 minutes into the talk here. And so for those of you who are inclined to leave early or nod off during the next period, let me give you the lecture's answer to the question. Is America a Christian nation? The answer is yes. No. 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 Sort of. Yes. And finally, no way. In other words, I expect to offend virtually everybody in this room. I'll begin the process of offense, our little journey here, with a premise that the Christianness in view is a variable, and that it's in the nature of variables to vary. To put it another way, Christianness is a variable attribute that is more or less applicable, its applicability varying with the different conceptual domains in terms of which one tries to understand reality. Let me make it more simple. This is not postmodern relativism. It is saying that a thing is what it is. But it's also saying that we need to be clear whether we're talking about one thing or another, and in what context. Now, the following discussion will cover 7 domains that seem particularly relevant for talking about America as a Christian nation. Good. I see the student notes are now starting to number 1 through 7. This is excellent, excellent teaching I see going on here. Let me also, by way of a sidebar, the quality of the statistical data, particularly from opinion surveys, leaves a lot to be desired, to put it mildly. And while I would not fight to defend any given data point, I do think the numbers indicate rough orders of magnitude in given directions. First domain. We might consider first the straightforward idea of demographic self-identification. What do Americans make of themselves with regard to this question of being Christians? By such profession, 82 to 85% of all adult Americans identified themselves as Christians at the beginning of the 21st century. Down a little bit from 89% in 1947, when Gallup first started asking those polls, but 82 to 85%, 2000, 2001, say they are Christians when they're asked to identify themselves religiously. Only 10% of Americans are in all non-Christian faith categories put together, 10%, with the remaining 8% willing to report themselves as being non-religious. Altogether, about 9 out of 10 adult Americans say they never doubt the existence of God. 8 out of 10 say prayer is an important part of their daily lives. These and similar statistics one could muster show a level of self-identified Christianity far above any European nation at a comparable level of development. Even among those Americans reporting no religion, that is 8%, half of those say they believe in a personal God and or that the Bible was divinely inspired. According to one survey, the American population, 281 plus million people, contained 2 million people, adults, explicitly choosing to identify themselves as atheists, agnostics, or secular humanists. A couple million. Generally speaking, then, in a world where statistically, demographically, the world population is 1/3 Christian, 1/5 Muslim, 1/6 non-religious, 1/7 Hindu, the United States obviously falls into that statistically Christian family of nations. And so, yes, in the domain of demographic self-identification, America is a Christian nation. The second domain. Here the situation changes when we look at Americans' self-professed belief in Christianity rather than their simple self-identification. While approximately 85% of American adults identify themselves as Christians, only 38% say they've confessed their sins and accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. Similarly, about 42% of Americans say they are absolutely committed to the Christian faith. On the other hand, a majority of all Americans, 60%, say they think there is no single religion that has all the answers to life's questions. So, how do Americans regard the relevance of Christianity to their everyday, actual lives? While over 80% of American adults identify themselves as Christians, only 45% of Americans strongly agree that the Christian faith is relevant to their lives for these days. Only about 1/4, maybe 1/3 of Americans say they base their moral decision-making primarily on principles and teachings of their religion. So where do most Americans look for moral guidance? Mainly, they seem to look to personal utilitarian calculations. Slightly over 6 out of 10 Americans report their moral guidance comes from considering what will bring the most pleasing results to themselves or to other persons. A similarly modest view of religion's claims appears in response to questions about meaningful personal lives and success in life. When Americans are asked how they define a successful life for themselves, about 60% give priority to a healthy family life or some tangible accomplishment, such as financial or educational goals. Another 14% point first to various kinds of emotional fulfillment, such as a prestigious job, sense of satisfaction in your vocation. Only 7% of Americans view spiritual wholeness and development as the factor defining a successful life. This is about the same proportion defining successful living as a matter of enjoying good physical health. Thus, while a majority of Americans report they pray daily, most also appear rather lukewarm about their religion's relevance to daily life. So what should we say? Is America a Christian nation? Not in the sense that a majority of Americans regard Christianity as a major element in interpreting the moral decisions and success of their daily lives. So in exploring the idea of a Christian nation, I've talked first about self-identification and second about personal profession in daily life. There's a third domain that might be called America's confessional standards as a Christian nation. Now, by confession, I'm not talking about the 2,500 or so separate Christian denominations in the country. I'm talking about the core doctrinal content that unites Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox churches into Christianity as such. Now, this is important because of all the world's religions. Christianity has spent the most sustained effort in debating and elaborating matters of doctrine. Beginning with the first council in Jerusalem, presided over by James, church conclaves, carefully articulated creeds, an insistence on authoritative teaching of propositional truths. This has been the hallmark of Western Christianity compared to other religions. To use an out-of-favor word, Christianity, since its beginnings, has delighted in dogma. Recent research seems unanimous in concluding that far from delighting in their religion's doctrine, American Christians have very little idea of or interest in what that doctrine might be. For example, in his recent book, Professor Alan Wolfe has tried to characterize how Americans live their faith. And as I read his findings, theology has pretty much gone missing in the transformation of American religion toward tolerance of divergent views. It's true, compared to secular Europe, Americans remain hyperactively religious, but their activity is little interested in seeking a God of theological truth and very interested in seeking out a religious community that serves one's personal needs. Where theological debates once raged, the hottest disputes, literally, in many churches are typically over preferences in styles of worship music. Other researchers, using admittedly fragile poll data, point to a similar non-creedal Christianity that prevails. When survey questions ask if there are absolute moral truths applicable to all people and times, the vast majority of Americans, 78%, agrees that moral truths are changeable depending on one's personal circumstances, or say they've never thought about it. Among born-again Christians, 2/3 say they do not believe there is such a thing as absolute moral truth. To be more doctrinaire in these issues, surveys on particular doctrines of Jesus invariably show that Jesus has what is called a very high approval rating. However, about half of Americans believe Jesus sinned during his life on earth, a character fault that fits poorly with someone who was not only fully human but fully God, according to the traditional teachings of the church. 90% of Americans own a Bible, and a large majority claims to know all its basic teachings. But 3/4 of Americans also wrongly believe that the Bible teaches that God helps those who help themselves. Of those Americans who have a view on the subject, the majority believes that a person will earn salvation if he or she is generally good or does enough good things for other people. In fact, a triune view of salvation seems to be the dominant mode of thinking in American Christianity, to judge from these admittedly iffy polls. Entry to eternal heavenly life seems to be gainable through 3 gates. 1, by completing a critical mass of good deeds. 2, by accepting God's grace through Jesus Christ, which is the church teaching. Or by counting on God's love for all people. This muddled theology of salvation is not surprising, since half of American Christians say they believe that all religious faiths teach the same basic principles. None of this corresponds to the authoritative teachings, that is to say, the centuries of dogma known to Christianity. The exact meaning of any of these statistics, not to mention the wording of poll questions, is obviously something one could debate at great length. The larger picture, however, seems clear enough. Americans are more interested in having religious faith than in the doctrines that define the meaning of the faith. It appears, if you're a typical American concerned with spirituality, and the vast majority of Americans say they are deeply concerned with spirituality, exactly which spirit they're concerned with, saying what, is left an open question. It appears that if you are a typical American concerned with spirituality, the odds are against any spirit claiming to impose obligations from outside yourself, as you yourself choose to define those duties. So, is America a Christian nation? In terms of knowledgeable creedal commitments, I would have to say the answer is no. And let me note by way of a sidebar again that this is not surprising. A non-creedal Christianity fits very well with a larger culture that endorses individual choice, tolerance of different views, and distrust of anyone's party line about what morality ought to be. As one scholar has recently put it in a book on this subject, reciting the Christian creed at worship is a countercultural act. Leading social scientists have rightfully pointed out the advantages to this non-creedal Christianity. As Professor Wolf describes American religion, quote, "The more we refrain from treating religion as if it has some status that makes it different from everything else in the world, the greater our chances of avoiding religion's ugly legacies while still being able to appreciate its benefits for the individuals who practice it and the democratic society they inhabit." He goes on, "Believers who prefer a God of love to a God of truth are not going to kill for their beliefs or give their support to those who kill." Unquote. And I think that is all very true. But it probably also means a religion that's not regarded as worth living for, much less worth dying for. This brings us to the matter of religious behavior, the fourth domain, if I'm counting correctly. In the fourth domain, we come to conduct, the area where Christian Scripture talks about being not only hearers but also doers of the word. In terms of many forms of virtuous behavior associated with Christianity, Americans again stand out among developed nations for which we have data. This is the case, for example, in terms of charitable giving. It's the case in terms of volunteering for social good works. It's the case for church-going and the like. Church-going is perhaps the most outstanding behavioral characteristic. In terms of attending organized religious services, I guess I should say this is either poll questions are asked outside the normal religious holidays, so these are not questions that are asked around Christmas time and Easter time or something like that. In terms, those terms, according to the data that we have, such as this, as people report their own behavior, outside religious holiday seasons, 40% of Americans report attending a worship service in the previous week, 7 days. This is probably the most common statistic used in comparing the religiosity of America with other nations. Less often used is the evidence that this self-reported church-goings often seems to be a lie. According to the actual time diaries kept by representative samples of Americans, only about 26%, not 46 or 40% of Americans, have actually attended a place of worship in the previous week. In terms of behavior that costs something in the pocketbook, significantly less than half of American Christians claim to tithe. But for this minority of self-proclaimed tithers, there is again some evidence of bearing false witness to one's pollster. A study of financial records showed that for regular church attenders claiming to tithe, the rate of false claims is about 63%. For born-again Christians, the record indicates the same 63% lying rate. The Christian characteristics of the larger culture are even less impressive. It's simply, I think, indisputable that American popular culture in recent decades has moved toward the widespread acceptance of behaviors never associated with Christianity. Gambling, public lewdness, foul language, mass consumption of pornography, and the like. For example, gambling revenues rose from about $1 billion in 1980 to over $60 billion, as far as it could be counted, in 1990. With only 3 states now lacking some form of legalized gaming, we call it not gambling, an activity once confined to criminal enterprises only a generation ago is now a significant source of funding for public agencies. To take another and probably too obvious example, one estimate is that Americans now spend between $8 to $10 billion annually on pornographic activities, otherwise known as adult entertainment. That's roughly equivalent to Hollywood's total box office receipts in this nation. Americans spend in strip clubs an amount exceeding the combined revenue of Broadway theaters, regional and nonprofit theaters, and symphony orchestra performances altogether. Now, it is true that in recent years, the revenues of leading commercial enterprises in the sex industry, Playboy, Hustler, adult book clubs, and stores, these have declined in the 1990s. However, this appears to be due to the ever-increasing supply of amateur pornography, with something like 300,000 websites now offering free sexually explicit content. In other words, technology has allowed the supply to expand to meet Americans' immense demand for pornographic material. In 2000, one survey found that 32% of men and 10% of women in that year had visited sexually oriented websites. And we can assume this is a major underestimate if there is the same extent of lying on this subject as there is on church-going and tithing. Another survey in 2000 by the magazine Christianity Today found 27% of America's pastors said they had sought out pornographic sites on the internet anywhere from a few times a year to a couple of times a month or more. Quite apart from pornography, since the mid-20th century, the crude sexual content of the general popular culture has grown beyond the bounds of any traditional Christian understanding of the sanctity of the human body. One is left with the obvious question. With a population that claims to be 85% Christian, who is making the popular culture popular? It is certainly not the remnant 8% of Americans who claim to have no religion. Seriously, it's worth noting, I think, an important implication for America's presentation of itself as a world power. Among millions of devout Muslims around the globe, ordinary people at the grassroots level, and by no means terrorists, there is a pervasive disgust at the loose morality of, quote, Christian America. If anything, the contempt is greater for Christian churches' indifference to sexual immorality, gambling, drinking, greed, crime, and so on. I suspect that if America declared itself an outright atheist nation devoted to hedonism and opposed to any theistic religion, the resentment of grassroots Muslims toward America would probably be less. At least then, there would not be the hypocrisy of dragging in Christian America the God of Abraham through the mud. So to look at the question again, is America a Christian nation? In behavioral terms that go to make up a working culture, the evidence simply does not support the charge. In fact, I would say the evidence does not even establish a prima facie case. The fifth domain focuses on the legal and institutional arrangements making up the American nation. Here we go into a little deeper history. It's a historical fact that America began as a 17th century remnant of European Christendom, a term summarizing the centuries of close, usually mutually reinforcing power between religious and civil rulers. English colonists in the New World found themselves wedged precariously between far stronger versions of that ideal of Christendom, with the Spanish to the south, the French to the north, both Christian empires to the west, and of course the official Church of England, Mother England, across the ocean to the east. The key point here is that before Americans were Americans, they were dissenters. Understood historically, this term means more than merely someone who dissents or protests. Dissenters were dissenters because they were first affirmers. In the religious history out of which America came, dissenters affirmed what they saw as a purified Christianity. Theirs was a Christianity whose truth claims did not depend on traditional intervening church-state structures, but, as they saw it, on the Bible's truths shown forth through the Holy Spirit to individual believers one at a time. In this fifth domain of law and institutions, in the fight over the place of official religion in America, it was the dissenters who eventually won out. That's the primary historical fact. The clarion call of dissenters as institutional builders in the American state was no preference, no penalty. Religious belief, to be authentic belief, had to exist without the helping hand of state power. No establishment of religion. And religious belief, to be authentic belief, also had to exist without the threatening frown of state power. Free exercise of religion. And so it was that we ended up with a First Amendment in the Bill of Rights that says what it says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, no preference, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. No penalty. Such was the dissenters' victory at the national level, and after some decades at the state level too, that we can read the following in the treaty with the Muslim power of Tripoli, signed by a very Christian president, John Adams, and affirmed by the United States Senate, founding fathers all. The treaty read in part, Article 11, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, and as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the same said United States never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammed power, it's declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions ever produce an interruption in the harmony existing between our two nations. To repeat the first sentence, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. No official religion. This in 1797, 100 years before Brewer's declaration about America being a Christian nation. And of course, we note the reference in the treaty's quotation is to the government of the United States. This takes us back to the essential point. Separation of church and state was at least as much a product of Christian thinking as of any secular Enlightenment persuasion. Following from John Locke, Roger Williams, and others, in a more or less straight line, through to James Madison's Virginia Remonstrance against Patrick Henry's proposal for state taxes for religious education, and on to the drafting of the First Amendment, the restraint on government for free exercise of religion was a religious and a Christian argument. Liberty was anchored in a deep conceptual sense of transcendent duty. It was man's duty to his Creator that produced the individual's inalienable right to freedom of conscience over against the secular power. It is not too much to say, I think, that from this flowed the sensibility to all the other rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that perceptive foreigners have come to call the American creed. From this has also come the modern celebration of what Alasdair MacIntyre calls choicism. In other words, choice as its own self-justifying norm and cultural end in itself. But to go down that road is not my point here. It's back to the question, is America a Christian nation? Its legal and institutional structures vigorously deny any such official endorsement. But in so doing, these structures have drawn heavily on the intellectual capital of their dissenting Christian heritage. So in this rather backhanded way, America is a Christian nation, sort of. The sixth domain for addressing America as a Christian nation looks not at formal institutions or Christian creeds or demographic identities and the like, but at the vaguer political ethos of the nation. As the culture wars raged in the 1980s, three distinguished historians of American religion, themselves Christian in background, investigated the claims of the religious right that America at its founding was a Christian nation that had changed under the pressures of secular humanism. Their research concluded that in its founding and colonial periods, America was not predominantly Christian in any rigorous or evangelical meaning of that term, but the American character was generally religious. For all the talk of separation of church and state, the position worked out in America's religious political culture was not a doctrine of dualism, not a view of two separate spheres of religion and politics. The strong pull of Puritan and other more general Christian thinking, where every mundane activity was coextensive with worship, did not allow that dualism. To say that Americans' character was generally religious is to say that it was a nation grown by people who believed, however crude their systematic theology might be, but people who believed that the temporal was shot through with happenings of eternal significance. The person, the citizen, was never understood to be divided into two beings, one religious spiritual and the other political temporal. Neither was the political society understood in that way. The energy propelling America's major reform movements has always been religious and moral, at least heavily religious and moral in character, rather than secular and utilitarian. Now, working out the political implications of this religious heritage has been a long-term project. In the nation's early years, Christian dissenters and establishmentarianisms, I can't say that word, establishmentarians, in other words, the people that were against church and state being divided and the people who were for church and state being divided, both camps could be found eagerly imposing laws to uphold religious values on the general public. Traditional Judeo-Christian norms were upheld in the earliest laws of this country, some requiring some conduct of a certain kind. Sabbath observance is a prominent example. Others prohibiting certain conduct, sexual activity outside monogamous marriage, a prominent example. Actual enforcement was another matter in such a mobile and fractious society. And in any event, the long-term story has been one of dismantling such laws, and in doing so, usually appealing to that principle, the sanctity of the individual and his or her free choice, that Christian dissenters had themselves implanted in the culture. Current controversies over anti-sodomy laws and gay marriage are only the latest example of that. What has remained amid this demoralization of statutory law? What has remained is what the founders and subsequent generations, for all their religious pluralism, have also held firmly in common. It's been called by some writers, such as Mark Knoll, the moral calculus of republicanism. In this view, the moral goods promoted by religion in general and Christianity in particular are regarded as vital in building and sustaining the virtues of citizenship. which are in turn seen as essential in a self-governing republic. A more expansive use of this calculus envisioned a redeemer nation whose story and mission has a decisive meaning for all mankind. But there's no time here to further go down that road of civil religion. The essential point is that America's republicanism has always embraced a religious political ethos. Some will say that contemporary America is only a pale reflection of the old ethos, and that may be true, but it's a reflection of something. The fact is that the traditional moral calculus of republicanism remains quite active in the American mind, even though the vast majority of Americans, 78% or so we saw after a 9/11 survey, do not believe there is such a thing as unchanging moral truth. For example, at the beginning of the 21st century, Americans told pollsters that the nation's worsening moral condition ranked as one of the 2 or 3 top priorities that needed to be addressed. In 2001, 3 out of 4 Americans repeated this worry about the moral condition of the nation. The same view was held by 2/3 of America's younger generation, aged 17 to 35. And in fact, it was a view held by 41% of atheists. And what's to be done about the moral condition? Here again, the old moral calculus clicks into place. Largely because of the moral threat to the nation, 70% of Americans in 2001 said they wanted to see religion's influence on American society grow. A subsequent poll even showed that over half of Americans, 54%, favored having government promote religion. Thus, what research into the founding period has shown remains true today. The political ethos of 21st century America is more vaguely religious than rigorously Christian. While 70% of the American public wants religion to become more influential in society and public life, 3/4 of these Americans say it does not matter to them which religion it is that becomes more influential. Not quite a ringing endorsement of Christianity as such, but that shouldn't obscure the more general point. In terms of a functioning political ethos, the nation's traditional moral calculus remains in place. Well, Americans continue to define this ethos in heavily moral terms. The long-standing political view expresses itself then in all sorts of favorable attitudes, very general, very symbolic, about religion in public life. Polling during the recent controversy on Judge Moore's 10 Commandment monument issue found 77% of Americans saying the monument should be allowed to remain in the Alabama courthouse. As for keeping the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, shortly to be addressed by the Supreme Court this term, various polls show between 80 and 90% of Americans support keeping this reference to a nation under God in the pledge. Recent presidential campaigns leave no doubt that politicians today are still required to show the religious dimension of their character or to explain the religious reason for their public reticence in doing so. As Howard Dean put it in assuring the media last month of his commitment to the Bible and Jesus Christ, his problem is that New England believers do not have a tradition of talking about their religion. So far as I can tell, there is no other developed nation in the world where leading politicians incur major public disapproval for failing to appear visibly religious. So this 6th domain, concerned with the overall political ethos of the public square, is probably something that by its very nature must always remain largely symbolic. But since symbols matter to human beings, it's no less important because of that. Hence, in a general, figurative sense, appropriate for speaking about such things, my conclusion is yes, America does meet the loose descriptive attributes of a Christian nation in terms of a political ethos. Finally, the 7th domain, and then our work is completed. We will not rest on the 7th. But we will conclude with a jarring thought. It might be not so much our answer or answers as the question itself that should be put on trial. How does Christianity judge our question about America as a Christian nation. This is an unfamiliar issue, I think, to raise in such a setting, but if we're going to think seriously about the subject, I think it is appropriate to ask what sense the question itself makes in a Christian context. Along these lines, the German theologian Rudolf Bultmann once wrote, "When we encounter the words of Jesus in history, we do not judge them by a philosophical system with reference to their rational validity. They meet us with the question of how we are to interpret our own existence." So from this perspective, the words associated with the founder of this Christian religion deal our question a harsh, perhaps a fatal blow. It is, of course, true that America can be a nation with a creed. As G.K. Chesterton pointed out, America does resemble a nation with the soul of a church precisely because it does have a creed laid out in the Declaration, the Gettysburg Address, and other scriptures of the civil religion. However, if we're willing to let Christianity judge, then Americans in the collective, as one of the nations of this world, cannot be Christian. As far as I can tell, the narrative recounting all the engagements between the founder of this religion and the powers of this world give a clear verdict in judging our question. Consider the two engagements that bracketed the earthly minister of the religion's founder. The first engagement took place with Satan's climactic temptation at the outset of the founder's public ministry. The tempter is described as offering the world to Jesus. And now we'll be quoting. "Once again the devil took him to a very high mountain, and from there showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their magnificence. 'Everything there I will give to you,' he said to Jesus, 'if you'll fall down and worship me.'" Now for our purpose, the interesting thing is that Jesus does not dispute that it's in Satan's legitimate power to offer all the kingdoms of the world to him. The current proprietorship is not in dispute. Instead of disputing the validity of the offer and the title claim, Jesus shifts the focus to a different plane altogether by quoting Deuteronomy. As you all probably know, "Away with you, Satan. The Scripture says, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." The ending bracket, the final engagement on this issue of religious nationhood, occurred about 3 years later before the Roman Empire's representative, Pontius Pilate. With the desertion of not only the fickle crowds, but also apparently of all family, friends, and disciples who had known him best, the public ministry is now in ruins, and the dialogue goes in the familiar form. Pilate: "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus: "Are you asking this of your own accord, or have other people spoken to you about me?" Pilate: "Do you think I'm a Jew? It's your own nation who handed you over to me. What have you done?" At this point, Jesus' response seems aimed precisely at transforming this idea of his own nation. In fact, two words in the Greek are used differently. Pilate asks about ethnos, nation. Jesus answers in terms of basileia, kingdom. The answer, "My kingdom is not founded in this world. If it were, my servants would have fought to prevent my being handed over to the Jews. But in fact, my kingdom is not founded on all this." It is, in fact, given its stance towards worldly powers, a peculiar religion, because its essence doesn't seem to be about moral rules or creeds or sexual norms. Its essence is a person. And this person tells us he's a king, a ruler, but not the ruler of a nation. The ruler of a kingdom, manifested by its servants in the world, but not of the world. So the last point is this. Ideas such as we've talked about here, the ideas of Christianity and Christian nation in America, The ideas in the same sense, Christianity and the American nation, are not so much incompatible as they are incommensurate. Seen from the perspective enunciated by the founder of this religion, the question tempts us to exalt the relative into an absolute. From this perspective, claims of patriotism, valid as they may be, remain inferior to the real reality. They threaten to lure well-meaning but shallow American Christians into making commensurate what is Caesar's and what is God's. I think it was this worry about this error that led the Christian scholar Richard Niebuhr to warn 70 years ago. The foes we need to defend ourselves against are always those in our own household, for these deceive us, as the foreign foe cannot. So we come to the end of our journey. Is America a Christian nation? First, yes, America is a Christian nation in a very broad sense of its formal demographic identity. Two, no, America is not a Christian, at least it's not a nation of Christians in any strong traditional meaning of that term. Not by everyday profession, not by doctrinal creed, not by cultural behavior. But again, third, yes, sort of. America is a Christian nation, a nation powerfully influenced by Christianity, both in its legal institutions and in its political ethos. And, as many founding fathers hoped, in the free marketplace of religious competition, America might someday become a nation of more rather than fewer Christians. But finally, no, as judged by Christianity itself, America is not and cannot be a Christian nation. The scripture that believers in this religion call holy indicates that only people, not collective entities, but people, one at a time, can be Christian. Any worldly power is incommensurate, an inferior thing. America, like every other worldly power, could never be a Christian nation and still be authentically Christian through this understanding. Thus, in our final domain, if one takes this religion seriously as it presented itself in human form, the answer to the question is no way. Thank you. So we can have some questions now, or feedback, or comments, or.
Yeah. Let me make one announcement, and that is, all of you are welcome to come to supper this evening over in the faculty dining room, third floor of McElroy. There will be a discussion that continues, led off by Professor Hale. In fact, about 7 o'clock after a light supper, and lasts till about 8:30. All of you are welcome.
Okay, let's explore this topic. Unless this was the decisive, conclusive, incontrovertible, unarguable. I'm overlooking hands now. I like the way this is going. I like this very much. Yes, sir.
Just wonder whether you would put together your last point with some of the earlier points. It seems to me...
I think people are having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry. If you would put together your seventh point, with some of your earlier points, it might be helpful to us. The last point was perhaps the most serious from the highest point of view, but from that point of view, all action, all concern with directions of a nation seems to be trivial and unimportant, and that wasn't the tone of the rest of your talk. And I wonder whether you would comment on that, whether the last point gave your final and overall judgment, or whether
some of the earlier points point to concerns and even to paths of action which are perhaps not of the highest level of importance, but still important for our earthly lives.
Yes, I like the way you put it, a kind of a hierarchy of being in my domains, if I could put it that way. I don't intend any of the first points to be straw men, to knock over, so you can get to, quote, the main point. I think they are all perfectly, quote, important points because they derive their importance from the domain in which you're asking the question. I accept the notion that the ultimate domain for asking that question to people who care about the answer, and I would presume not many people may even care about asking or answering the question except in a quick political way. But to those that care about what the question entails, what lies behind the question, I agree totally. I think the last view is the final word for me. It doesn't imply, withdrawal from the world. It doesn't imply feeling patriotic towards your country. It doesn't imply falling over yourself with guilt because you might check out a pornographic site or anything like that. It does say when you ask this question, try and be as serious about it as you can in trying to answer it. And when you get as serious about it as you can, or at least when I get as serious about it as I can, I'm drawn into that last realm. When I first wrote this out, there were 10 points, because I thought 10 was better, commandments and all that. But eventually it turned out there were only 6. And then at the end of it all, I said to myself, well, wait a minute. What about judging the question? And that's where that last point comes from. And to me, that was where I'd always probably wanted to get to without knowing it. Yeah. And in a way, some of those earlier points are a little bit by way of inoculation against loose political rhetoric about the Christianness of America. Be careful how we use words. Yeah, Mickey?
Throughout the talk, I had a sense of one dimension omitted, and that's the historical dimension. That is change over time.
Okay.
We're dealing with 2 centuries of enormous transformation of the demographic, the Christian religious background of the people, the economy, the culture, and yet I had the sense that while some of your examples are drawn from the present and others have a truly timeless quality about them, there's no overall sense of whether there was any significant change in the response to this question over.
Well, yes, and the first version of asking the question was exactly your historian's mind infecting me. It was, have we become, or have we been, or that kind of question. And as I worked my way through, oh my heavenly days, 1 hour to talk about all of that and so on. No way. What might be most helpful would be to try and address the current present tense sense of that question and use history as it may or may not be appropriate, but not try and give the account of what happened when. I think people like Mark Noll are quite right when they point out that if the, quote, founding was religious, it was certainly not evangelically Christian in the way that politically active folks on the religious right would like. That came later, and Brewer was writing out in the high noon, I suppose you could say, of this high Protestant evangelical culture, and people would just say, oh yeah, sure. So your point's great, but I can't do it. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I'm still digesting what you said during your presentation, so I don't know if I'm formulate this question exactly what I want to. But, in your presentation, you talked about whether we were a Christian nation or not.
Whether we are.
Or whether we are. And looking at it from a different perspective, a Christian can be a Christian in any kind of regime. And what you described as the early America was certainly a place that would welcome a Christian, wouldn't be antagonistic to a Christian. When you talk about the...
There were some Quakers that thought they were Christians, and it did not seem like they were welcomed in some Christian communities.
But,
Same with Baptists.
as you talked about the ethos and about the structure and about the, I think you called it secular dogma in the United States.
The political ethos of the United States.
Has it turned that as a political regime we have become antithetical to Christianity?
What do you mean as a political regime?
In the structure that we have today, as it's evolved, that this is not a political regime that is that has become hostile to Christianity.
I personally do not see that. I know people that do. I had 2 students in my class last term wrote papers. One, a devout Christian young lady, Megan, and her paper was all on exactly your point, how the whole system has turned hostile and is anti-Christian, and how hard it is. You know, the other lady, Margaret, wrote from a admittedly atheist secularist human, and her whole complaint was how oppressive and how monolithic the whole Christian institutional cultural structure is to people like her. You know, each one of them feeling oppressed, and that's kind of what I was saying. I don't see Christians being, as you describe it, by the government, by the law. You know, you can pick out events and instances, and I suppose the public school system is a classic example of that, where for a variety of reasons, including fear of litigation, you know, in some places at some times, educational bureaucrats sort of are silly in trying to obliterate just commonsensical expressions of religion and so on. So you end up in court, you know, and can you wear this but not that, and so on. Can you know, if there's a fundraising drive, can you buy a brick that has a Christian cross on it, or do you have to say there are no religious symbols in our school pavement? You know, those kinds of things. Yeah, they're going on all the time. But I don't see it as anything cumulative or overwhelmingly evident on a large scale. But who knows? I'm probably wrong.
If you take off the last question, which has been pointed out, changes the others, just bracket that. Has there been in the world, going back to historical perspective, either the United States or any other country, in Europe or elsewhere, that has met all of those criteria and been a Christian nation?
Met all of the criteria.
All of your, would satisfy all of your...
No, these were not, you know, cumulative criteria. You know, you can do 3 or 4, but...
Wrong
you know,
word. Would have been defined as a Christian nation in all of the domains that you mentioned, except for one. Has there ever been?
Mickey, you can help me out. I'm no historian. I can't think of one that you could say... you can say a lot of, yes, they're statistically, demographically Christian in terms of creedal commitments. I don't know if you went back and, you know, studied some of the small principalities and powers when Lutheran princes were dominating the churches and everything else. They probably were pretty good on creedal statements insofar as people were literate. But it's too hard a question. I don't know. Are you implying that I'm sort of setting a bar that nobody's ever met?
Well, I guess I'm wondering why who's asking the question and what by any sensible standard is meant by it.
I think that's a valid point, and that's why I really introduced the talk the way I did. And there are parts of the country where to even ask the question shows you don't get it. You know, of course this is a Christian nation. And there are other parts or places in the culture where to ask the question is to express intolerance and moralistic hegemony and so on. And in the broader sense, my point was that we live in a society where political debate is repeatedly raising that thing, and it's going to come up in spades in this election campaign. And the words are going to get used really loosely. And my hope, as I say, was sort of to inoculate a little bit that whenever you hear the word Christian nation, watch out, be careful, and start parsing language of in what sense, where are we talking? Because what I notice is that sort of rhetorical advantage is gained, and I'm sure some people aren't doing this intentionally, but it's gained by starting in one domain and working out to another domain to pull in conclusions. And that's how you beat your opponent. You argue to win, of course, and it doesn't matter how you do it. But that's not what scholars are supposed to do. And as I think about students, as they face this society that we've created for them, and they become citizens, I really want them to be careful thinkers on the subject of America as a, quote, Christian identity for the nation. So that your point is, really important. Yeah, Peter?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the interplay between your last domain and the previous 6, 7, 8. I've lost track of how many there were.
There are only 6 plus the 7.
Okay.
Okay.
Since that last one does loom so importantly, there's another criterion that strikes me as rather Christian, which is that Christianity simultaneously sets a very high bar, it seems to me, in terms of what, if you take it seriously, to live by it. There aren't too many Mother Teresa's.
And even Mother Teresa apparently had her doubts.
Yeah. But the flip side of that is a strong sense of charity and forbearance. What I'm driving at is that if one is going to judge ultimately by some sort of Christian standard, as suggested by the last one, that your domains aren't very Christian. That the bar is set too high. That it's not very Christian to look at people's only at their actions and not to take seriously their efforts to try to attain almost unattainable goals. I'm not sure where I want to go with this, but it just seems to me that there's a dimension here, since you end up on judging Christianity by Christian standards, judging the domain by
judging the claim of Christian nationhood by Christian standards.
You ought to be more tolerant of the gap between people's professed beliefs and actions, and therefore that arbitrates your judgment about whether or not we're a Christian nation.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of the survey results of the most popular verse that people can quote in the Bible. And it's quotable by just about everybody. I don't know, Matthew 7 or whatever. Judge not that you be not judged. That's the kind of the emblematic quotation from the Bible. They don't go on to read farther down in the verse where it's saying, don't cast your pearls among swine, don't give what's holy to dogs. That's kind of drawing some distinctions. It would seem a little bit intolerant. As I say, the point of the lecture from the beginning is to try and give a, quote, scholar's view of the use of political language and the carefulness with which it should be used. But at the end of the day, the scholar takes off the scholar's hat and says, okay, suppose you were a Christian, what might you want to say about this subject? And that's where that comes from. And I think one's right to say, well, there's an incommensurability here between the last and everything else. And that's right. And that's exactly what I find in the Christian's version of Scripture. There is this incommensurability. What do you do about it? Well, you're in this in-between situation as a practicing Christian, I'm sure. And you're always on this, Martin Buber called the narrow ridge. Not being a Christian, I think he still had the imagery right. That between the engagement with the world and the withdrawal from the world, between the sense of exile and being belonging here, that it really is a pilgrimage, and there's the life of tension is the only life between those tensions that you're going to have, as long as you're being adult and serious about things. But also, when you go back to Mickey's point, when you look at historically at how patriotism has tried to expropriate, claims of Christian identity, it is really very scary what can happen in a country that, look back at some of the old rhetoric in the First World War, and even in the Second World War. The first decision that came down on compulsory Pledge of Allegiance to the flag in West Virginia said the kids have to do it. We're that kind of country because that's our identity. And that was a wartime decision. Upon reflection, the court said only a few years later, no, these Jehovah's Witnesses kids don't have to give a pledge of allegiance if it violates their religious belief. But in that heat of patriotism and yearning for some larger purpose to justify our hurt and the need for us to sacrifice, kind of latching on to the Christian nation idea became very, very tempting. And who knows, it still could. Mark?
Okay, so we exclude the last seventh category because it doesn't really apply to me.
Okay, so the answer then is yes, no, sort of, yes.
So get rid of the seventh. As I travel in Western Europe, I'm just astonished by the fact that the Western European countries would be 0 for 6. So we're 1.5 for 6, and they're 0 for 6. And I guess I just want to press you on what is it. Some of the things that would seem to me that the essence of important religious matters are things that we're 0 on. You live by the stuff. You take the creed seriously. So what is it that accounts for the 1.5? Why are we there? Why do we still have? Why are we in those particular? Only in those ways, and we're going to be domain specific. Why are we 1.5 of a Christian out of 7 Christian?
I once heard Ronald Dworkin give a talk. Remember, who Ronald Dworkin was, and he came to your exact same puzzle. He said, look, I'm from Europe. I'm from England. I don't get this country here in America. How is it that these people are just so overwhelmingly taken up with this superstitious nonsense of religion? And, I think a lot of the answer goes back to James Madison and the founders who said, if you have freedom, religion will flourish. If you have an official state church, you kill the spirit. And I think we have been constantly infused and regenerated by the free current of religious impulses that obviously were there from the beginning, but were allowed and are allowed to flourish and bubble and so on. And whereas in Europe, it eventually killed the spirit, I guess. But I don't have a great answer to your question. Yes.
I'm going back to the why the question, is America a Christian nation, comes up. It seems to me, though, I don't know if you would agree with it, it comes up, it's asked because people are trying to answer other questions.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to answer political questions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the context of those political debates, or as a result, because of those political debates, that the question is asked. And it wasn't clear to me quite how you think you should approach or connect the political questions, or you should connect Christianity, or shouldn't, with political questions. So, for example, if a student were to come to you and say, I want to be a good citizen, I want to do some judicious deliberation about gay marriage in America, how do I do that? How do I leave if I'm a Christian, do I leave my Christian faith at home? Do I bring it to bear? How do I think about that question? And that's the point at which I think your seventh domain and the other six, somehow in our real lives, we can't separate things so completely.
Yeah. How would you answer if a student came to you? I would.
Sorry, but
I would be.
I
I don't think. Well, first of all, I would have to maybe even regain consciousness from getting up off the floor that a student came in with such an intelligent and wonderful question and was willing to talk to me about it. You know, that, I'm sure it's in minds, but you know, to come in and actually want to talk to your professor about such a thing, wouldn't that be wonderful?
the existence of God.
I don't know. I would tell the student, number one, you don't and you should never, quote, leave your faith at the door. You're a whole person, and that's part of you, and you have to come with that. Your search is something that should be respected by seeking out the most reliable, intelligent work that's been done from both inside your own tradition and from those who don't share your tradition. And in that regard, I think we would want to look at, with the student, you know, this is now turning into a couple semesters of work, but that the debate understood both contemporaneously and historically within your own faith tradition. I would say this to Muslim students too, for that matter. I have a fair number of Muslim students where I teach. Because I suspect you haven't done that yet, have you? And the answer would be no, I haven't. So first, know thyself, in a sense, and then try and know what other people are saying about this issue from another unbelieving perspective that you have. But at the end of the day, when you have to vote, you know, you vote as a whole person. But, you know, how would you answer it now? I've answered it.
I think I might be more concerned, yes, the student has to vote as a whole person, but to think about at what points it's appropriate to bring your faith to bear on the rest of the country, and at what points it's not, in what ways it isn't appropriate. But I guess the difficulty is, you had said, you know, Americans don't function as dualistic. They don't, in practice, separate church and state quite so much.
No, as of religion and politics.
Or religion and politics. But they don't do that because each of those domains, religion and politics, demands that not be done. And so each one claims somehow to be the whole of your life. And so I wasn't satisfied with your point on the seventh domain. My dissatisfaction might be with Christianity, not with your account of it. That the idea that of a faith that doesn't give us guidance in the world we have to live in and in the communal life we have to lead is disturbing.
I wouldn't think the student would say, my faith gives me no guidance.
But I thought, in effect, that you suggested that it essentially Christianity is so far from the concerns of politics and disdains the concerns.
No, I didn't mean to imply that it disdains the concerns of politics.
That you can be a Christian, but then the question, I thought you said you can be a Christian, but there cannot be a Christian collective.
Yeah.
But you can't, but politics is a collective, and therefore the question is, how do you connect this thing which you say has no collective being to the collective being which you necessarily live in and have to make decisions? I don't know how not to leave the student hanging.
Well, I think we leave them hanging either with a more intelligent view of the situation of their hanging or a less intelligent view. But there you are left hanging, I think. If I were in another kind of teaching setting, I would not leave them hanging. But in this sort of setting, I certainly would, say there are views, for example, Richard Rorty would argue that none of this kind of argument based on religious conviction and so on should be allowed in the public square. Not only is it unacceptable or unhelpful, but it really shouldn't be allowed. That voice has no place at the table. And are there good arguments for that? Let's talk about that. Because that's kind of the meta issue that you're asking about. And there are good arguments for that. To me, they aren't ultimately convincing, but there are some good arguments for that. On the other hand, if your religion doesn't affect what happens in the society you live around and you're a part of, and that you are, in a democratic way, partially responsible for, if it isn't informed by your religious being as a human, what's going on here? And I think in America it's been, troublesome. It's been sometimes oppressive, but Americans have, at least historically, always believed that the faith is a faith that fights to improve the world too, and these reform movements are ways of doing that. But at a certain point, as for example, in the religious right, after all the heat and excitement of the 1980s, there were some on the religious conservative right who said, it was correct for us to engage politically, but we now, I'm thinking people like Thomas and so on, it was absorbing us. We allowed it to get off the realm it should have been in and allowed it to become an end over above, or at least co-equal with what we thought of as our Christian commitment. And so it's time for us to pull back from the culture of political wars in the name of our religion. And that's why I was saying it's really a life of tension between the engagement that you would find helpful in the public square and the disengagement that could be corrupting once it happens. Well, I think we've probably earned our supper by now. It's 5:30. Let's hope the rain has stopped.